Hi, and welcome to UMASS Beyond the Classroom. My name is Caroline Burns, and today we're with Professor Betsy Krause, author of Tight Knit. How are you?
I'm great. Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, it's a great time. For those who haven't at home who haven't read your book, can you please explain to me what it's about?
Sure. So, the book is about globalization and how families cope with globalization, and specifically, it's a book about the fast fashion world and the Chinese migrants who are making fast fashion in Italy.
Interesting,
Yeah.
yeah. Looking at your book now, the cover is beautiful. Can
Oh,
you
thank you.
explain to me what the thought process behind that was?
Sure. Well, the thought process was really the press that had a designer who made it, but I was really surprised when I got the cover because I had hired an Italian photographer to go around to some of the Chinese workshops. Many of the workshops are family firms. They're small. There's 5,200 of them, by
Wow,
the way, in Prato. So a lot of entrepreneurs and
yeah.
a lot of other workers who come in and then pay off debt and work their way up to owning their own firm. And so I had sent the press, the University of Chicago Press, photos from a photographer of a lot of these workshops. And so when I got back this cover, I was really surprised. At first, I wasn't sure what to think about it. I really loved that they took one element from a piece of clothing, a label, and then they put fashion in two different languages. First, it was just in English and Italian, and then I suggested that they add it in Chinese as well with
Yeah,
the Chinese characters. But I really like the cover. I think that it's quite snazzy
it's
and
eye-catching for sure.
yeah,
Yeah, I love it.
exactly. So.
So what inspired you to write this book and do your research?
Yeah, sure. So I actually did a study abroad in Italy as an undergraduate, and so I had spent time in Florence, and I have to say that it was really had a profound impact on me. And then later on, I went back to Italy to do my dissertation research, and I was looking at demographic change, the change from very large families to very small families in Italy, and I was working in a production zone where there were a lot of sweater makers.
Yeah.
Almost every house had a sweater maker. And so that was the mid 90s, and I kept going back to Italy. And by the early 2000s, when I went back, almost all the Italians had got out of the textile industry, especially sweater making, and there were a lot of Chinese migrants. You could even see it on signs, the
Oh yeah.
signage on the streets. And so I figured that since my field site was changing, that I really should do another project on this phenomenon of so much immigration in Italy and focusing on the Chinese migrants specifically. There's a lot of Chinese migrants in Prato, just north of Florence. Some of them, like I said, have their own firms and are making fast fashion to sell in Europe and Eastern Europe markets, and some of them are part of the sort of subcontracting supply chain and work for made in Italy brands that are luxury brands.
Yeah. Can you explain the Made in Italy brand for
Yeah,
me real quick?
sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the Made in Italy brand, it's a label and it carries a lot of prestige. It actually goes back to the early 20th century when fascism was ruling Italy, and there was a very nationalist sentiment and this policy of autarky, which means that the borders were pretty closed, and so there was a real emphasis to try to beat the French at fashion because there was French hegemony, and so the idea was to innovate new fibers, and this idea of Italianità, which is the Italian identity, and what finally evolved after World War II. We don't usually associate Made in Italy with fascism. That's sort of the background,
Yeah.
but what happened after World War II is there was a big economic boom, and the Made in Italy label became associated with this sort of easy elegance.
Yeah.
And of course, the film industry played a part. This big famous flood in 1966 in Florence also brought a lot of attention to Italy and the sort of association between the Renaissance and things made in Italy.
Yeah.
And so I think a lot of the prestige, one of the things I argue in the book, has to do with where the value of the Made in Italy brand really comes from. And I think a lot of it has to come with this, has to do with this association between the Made in Italy as a brand and the Renaissance. And so there's this sort of sense of, yes, if I buy Made in Italy, I'm buying the heritage,
History.
the
Yeah.
history and the heritage, and there's this sort of historical
Mm-hmm.
sentimentality connected. And so you can imagine that having Chinese now, given the hegemony of global supply chains, that there's some controversy and there's some tension.
Yeah.
And so one of my Italian sweater maker friends told me, he said in Italian, "Siamo noi I Cinesi." We are the Chinese, meaning we Italians. We occupied the same sort of structural position that the Chinese occupy now. We were in relationship to the Germans. We were like the self-exploiting,
Yeah.
workers working 24/7, and that's sort of what the Chinese now are doing in order to be competitive.
Yeah. During your research, what were some of the biggest migrant pressures that you saw in like Italy?
Yeah, I think the migrant pressures have to do with pretty much everything.
Yeah.
So healthcare, health inequalities, health access. There are a lot of and there's a lot of pressures politically for sure. We've seen a big political shift and lurch to the right, the far right in Italy, because of a lot of racism and xenophobia and fear. And then we have a lot of the Chinese. There's a lot of family pressure. So for a lot of the Chinese in Prato are young, and they get married and they have babies, and so there's a lot of babies being born to immigrant parents in the hospitals in Prato, and so there's a lot of demand on healthcare workers and a lot of challenges as well. And one of the paradoxes is that many of the Chinese parents, when I was doing my research, that they would after about 3 months they would send their infants back to China to be raised by
Yeah.
the children's grandparents. And this is another way that, in fact, there's a lot of diverse economic activity going on
Yeah.
that's not exactly capitalist, that underwrites the sort of capitalist value in the fashion industry.
Yeah.
Yeah.
In your book, you discuss how globalization is changing basic human conditions. Can you elaborate how this is happening?
Yeah, so I think the formation of global households is one of the examples of how humans are changing. And so one of the metaphor of the title, tight knit, refers to the idea that even though families might be far flung, they're still very tight knit.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of challenges with that as well. I think another way that globalization is changing the world has to do with health. Right now we see the coronavirus. The epicenter of the coronavirus moved recently from where it started in Wuhan province in China, and now the CNN today's front page of La Repubblica has a map from CNN News, U.S. CNN
Yeah.
News, that is showing Italy as the new epicenter of contagion for the coronavirus. And La Repubblica and the Italian officials are quite angry with CNN
Yeah.
for this map.
Yeah.
So, but this is the way that globalization really impacts our lives in terms of global supply chains, and unexpected things happen. So it makes it understanding the nitty-gritty of globalization is really what I, as an anthropologist, try to do, is get at these sort of how is it lived? How do people cope with globalization? How do families cope with globalization? How do institutions cope with globalization?
Yeah. So you're a professor here at UMass in anthropology, and I actually took your class called Fascism and Fashion.
That's
Can
right.
you explain how those two like connect?
Yeah, you bet. You took my class called Italy Fascism to Fashion, which is a class that the title really refers to these two, fascism and fashion are two phenomenon that were big in the 20th century. So the title is a way for me to anchor a class that's really about cultural anthropology. It's about culture, symbols, politics, pluralities of perspectives, and class differences, gender, sex, sexuality, race, etc. And so it is a class that allows us to think a lot about the 20th century, all of the changes from an agricultural society to a post-war, very industrialized society, and now a real center of migration, whether it's migration, transnational migration from China or from Africa, Eastern Europe, etc. So the class was focused on a number of questions that are really contemporary and have to do with culture and power.
Yeah, and it was really interesting seeing how everything connected back to like fashion.
Yeah, a lot.
Yeah.
We've connected a lot back to
Yeah,
fashion.
yeah, a lot. Do you believe fascism is still alive today in our society?
Well, I like to refer to Umberto Eco's Fascism essay that he wrote for the New York Review of Books some decades ago. And Fascism really is a way to talk about eternal fascism. So if we do a little mind exercise and we think about the numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, and then we think about 4 sets of letters, A, B, C, B, C, D, C, D, E, and D, E, F. And the first groups, obviously, they share A, B, C, and B, C, D, share 2 letters in common. When we go to the first to the third, there's 1 letter in common. And when we go from the first to the fourth, there's none. But there's still something in common. There's a structure there,
Yeah.
right? There's a sort of a family resemblance. And so that's really, if we think about fascism, there are certain elements of fascism that Umberto Eco talks about, and I'll just mention 3 that come to mind. And one is fear of the other.
Mm-hmm.
Another one is very strong nationalism, and a third one really has to do with sort of strong patriarchal values, misogynist, anti-woman kind of politics and policies. And I think all of those 3 we saw under fascism, under Mussolini, in the early 20s and in the 30s up to 1944. And we also see today rising xenophobia. We under Mussolini was made abortion a crime against the race. He taxed bachelors, right, and he gave prizes to women for having lots of babies. And so right now we have incredible attacks on reproductive freedom in the United States. So these are similarities that we can draw. We also attacks on our democratic institutions. Mussolini outlawed political parties. We haven't gotten to that point, thank goodness. However, there are a lot of attacks on voting rights and that sort of thing. And so we can draw parallels. And I think that it's important to look to history to understand the present, and so that we don't repeat certain mistakes.
Yeah.
To learn from the past.
Yeah. Very interesting. So where can we purchase your book?
Sure. Well, you can purchase my book on Amazon. You can purchase it right here locally at Amherst Books in Amherst, Massachusetts. You can purchase it from the University of Chicago Press website. And I bring my book to the merch table over in East Hampton at the New City Brewery. Every 3rd Wednesday, there's a show called the New City Opry, and there's a merch table. So you can even buy it directly from me.
Fun, great, yeah. Well, thank you for having us. Thank you for having you. This is all the time we have. It was great talking to you outside the classroom.
Yeah, thank you so much. It was really, really a lot of fun.
Yeah,
My pleasure.
It was great.
Yeah.
And thank you for joining us today. Come back next time at UMASS Beyond the Classroom for our next episode.